You are a British factory owner at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Your factory is successful, but you are unusual amongst your class. For, when you walk across the factory floor and see children crawling among the clanging machines, or when you hear of the squalid living conditions of your workers living in the factory towns, you can't help but feel a twinge of guilt. Then you hear of an experimental Scottish factory called New Lanark, run by the enterprising Welshman Robert Owen. You visit New Lanark and are impressed. Unlike in your own factory, the workers here seem well fed, rested, and relatively content. There, in a picturesque valley in central Scotland, Robert Owen has built what you thought was impossible. A factory run with the welfare of its workers in mind, which turns a profit. Later, after you return home, you hear that Owen has written down his ideas in a book. You buy it. Within it, Owen outlines his idea for what he calls a cooperative commonwealth. An empire in which every citizen, regardless of class, lives in harmony and works toward the common good. The idea appeals to you, not least of all because, Owen insists, it is the only surefire way to avoid revolutions like those which have recently overtaken France. You talk about it with your friends, but then you put the book back on your shelf and you return to your factory. The book gathers dust and you forget about your guilt. This is the story of why Robert Owen thought he could convince the British ruling class to build a socialist utopia, and how he failed.
Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more.
You've probably never heard of Robert Owen. Any Marxist watching this video might have heard his name mentioned in the Communist Manifesto, where he and his movement come in for direct criticism. Like Engels had a major beef with the guy. If Engels were a YouTuber today, there would definitely be several videos on his channel called something like, "Did Robert Owens really just say that?" or "Responding to Robert Owen's bonkers claim." Robert Owen fulfilled a similar function within Georgian and early Victorian society as maybe someone like George Soros or Bill Gates forms in our own, albeit with less money. He was a rich guy with a conscience who used his considerable fortune to spend on social and political causes he cared about. And the guy had access. I mean, he was friends with Queen Victoria's dad and socialised with various British politicians and aristocrats. At one point, he would even lecture the Houses of Congress in America and hobnob with the president. Now, although Robert Owen has been pretty much forgotten today, it is my contention that Robert Owen has had more of an impact in the development of the British left than Karl Marx has. Why? Well, that's what we're about to find out. So strap in, comrades, because we're going to learn about the OG Labour centrist. So what did Robert Owen want? Well, if you root about online, you might find articles describing him and his experiment in New Lanark as something called ethical capitalism. And certainly his factory in Scotland is trying to be an ethical business within the framework of the profit motive. You would have to go a long way indeed to find a factory in the early 19th century that does more for working rights than his. But Robert Owen was not a capitalist, or at least that's not how he saw himself. No, if you asked Robert Owen, he would tell you he was a socialist. Specifically, Robert Owen is a utopian socialist. Now, utopian socialism is an interesting strain of pre-Marxian socialism that maybe I'll do a future video on. But basically, utopian socialists and Marxists are united in their desire for a post-scarcity communist society. But where Marxists tend to stress the inevitability of class struggle and the need for revolution, utopian socialists believe that these aims can be achieved voluntarily by convincing the elite of the righteousness of our cause. So basically it is Marxism-Leninism Joe Biden thought. And how are we going to convince the property elite to give away their power and interests voluntarily? Well, in Robert Owen's case at least, it was something like socialism through osmosis. Fundamentally, Owen is a philosopher of education. He believed that if you got a child early enough and taught them with the right ideas, they would then leave the schoolroom and go into society and live those right ideas. This would lead them to living better lives, but also influence those around about them to also live better lives. Conversely, he also believed that many of the problems facing his society were, at their root, problems of poor education. Now, partly what this meant is that he believed that the working class were not being given the right skills to escape their poverty. So far, so liberal. But perhaps what made his critique a little bit more socialist, was that he has a real clear idea for the injustices facing the working class, believing that their poor conditions were caused primarily by environmental factors rather than being as a result of poor morals. And why does the injustice of working class poverty exist? Well, for Owen, they stem from the inattention of mankind to the circumstances which incessantly surround them, and from the want of a correct knowledge of human nature in those who govern and control the affairs of men. That is to say, that ignorance of the causes of the poor living conditions by the ruling class were preventing the ruling class from implementing the right reforms to make these injustices fade away. So he believes that if he could just reform the education system of the United Kingdom, he could create something that he calls a cooperative commonwealth, a land in which both capital and the working class work in harmony toward the greater good, in which everyone can benefit.
And what is the right education that would achieve all this? Well, if the school he established beside his factory in New Lanark is any indication, it is one in which rote learning is banished, in which the individuality of each child is catered for, in which classrooms are filled with maps, books and paintings that should be incorporated into the lessons, in which a high premium is placed on focusing on the mental development of the child, both academically and socially, and in which outdoor learning is encouraged.
Now, don't get me wrong, I think that how Owen set up his school is more or less how you should set up a school, and his views on education are progressive, not only in his own time, but ours. If Robert Owen were to return today, he would definitely make an appearance in a Ron DeSantis speech about how the wokeness has taken over education. But I think Robert Owen puts too much weight on the transformative power of education. As someone who's taught for many years now, I do believe that, in the right hands, education can be transformative in the life of an individual student. But if the material conditions outside the classroom are not conducive to success, then there's only so far that education can go. To put it another way, Catholic schools have existed now for hundreds of years, but the existence of Catholic schools has yet to win the world for Catholicism. And by the 1820s, I think Robert Owen had, at least on some level, realised this. He'd spent much of the 1810s pushing for legislative reform in the British Parliament, and while he had achieved some success in passing moderate reform to factory labour laws for children, he was frustrated at the slow pace of change. But Robert Owen still believed that the British establishment could be convinced to build his utopia. He just had to try something different. So Robert Owen went to Indiana.
Robert Owen had been born into fairly modest family circumstances, so his entry into British high society wasn't a given. His access was granted by two things. The first, his 1800 marriage to his wife, a relation of the Dukes of Breadalbane, and second, his success at the factory in New Lanark. And it is the second one in particular that gave him the authority to speak. He had proven that he could play ball in the capitalist system, and so he kind of became the acceptable face of radicalism for the British elite. But obviously, that only got him so far. While people were willing to listen to him, acting on what he said was a very different matter. So he gets this idea. At New Lanark, he had always been constrained by his shareholders, who, according to his biographer, were pretty glad to actually see the back of him and his experiments in worker management. So, he decides what he needs to do is establish something he calls a preliminary society. These would be communes, free from the interference of shareholders, in which he could demonstrate that his ideas worked in the real world, and, having made this demonstration, finally convince the ruling class of the worth of his ideas. Owen moves to America, which he thinks is free from the vested interest plaguing Europe, and buys a 30,000-acre property along the Ohio River from a cult called the Rapites. It's pretty much a perfect location for his needs. The cult has already cleared the land and built some houses. All he needs to do is find the settlers. Owen goes on a speaking tour to publicise the commune, which he calls New Harmony. He said that he was there to build a new moral world, akin to the second coming of Christ. He spoke of how, in his preliminary society, they would abolish things like the family, courts, prison and government, reform marriage, and uphold complete equality between the sexes. It was, to quote an early convert, not the desertion of society which is proposed, but the solution of the great social problem on which depends the actual salvation of the world. So, did New Harmony lead to the salvation of the world?
No, it did not. In fact, his new moral order, founded in 1825, lasted barely 3 years. And why was this Owenite community such a failure? Well, the Owenite commitment to complete equality and their desire to abolish government meant that the community had no way to arbitrate between disputes. Very quickly, for example, a split formed between those who thought democracy meant that the entire community should be consulted on every decision, and those that thought that day-to-day decisions could be delegated to responsible parties. With no way of resolving this dispute, the argument rolled on until the direct democracy camp formed their own separate commune in the far corner of the property. A similar struggle would ensue between those who believed that the new moral order should be entirely secular and those who believed there was a place for God in their socialism, and in another dispute between the Christian socialists over what exact version of God should be included. By 1828, Owen had had enough, and he returned to England. And since he still owned most of the property at New Harmony, it scuttled the project. The Owenite movement would try and found other communes, but all met with a similar fate, the longest lasting a mere 6 years. All were plagued with an inability to resolve disputes, and all tended to be over-reliant on one rich guy. In one famous example from Ireland, the Owenite community would wake up one morning to realise that their rich benefactor had lost all their land while gambling in Dublin. So Owen's preliminary society was a little bit of a damp squib. But Owen wasn't done. He had failed to convince the elite to back his ideas through argumentation, and his prototype had also failed. But Owen had one card left to play, and for that he needed the working class.
Owen returns to England at a moment of increasing tension between the early trade union movement and the upper classes, and Owen was pretty upset by all this. You see, Robert Owen saw trade unions not as vehicles for political and economic change for the working class, but instead as facilitators of better cooperation and understanding between workers, managers and owners. But in all this unrest, Owen sees a chance. In 1833 he founds the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, or the GNCTU, a body that would bring together all the different trade unions in one organisation. As its head, he hopes to act as a negotiator between the working class political movement and the upper class, finally leading them all toward, Pied Piper-like, his cooperative Commonwealth. He meets with some initial success, attracting millions of members to the GNCTU. However, his experiment in trade union organising would collapse in less time than that of his experiment at New Harmony.
At the beginning of 1834, capital and government interests became increasingly hostile toward trade unions, orchestrating things like lockouts, crackdowns on trade union organisation, arrests and deportations. In response, the trade union movement became increasingly militant. This situation angered Robert Owen. But Robert Owen wasn't angry at the government, no, instead he was angry at the trade unions. Because remember, he believes that the ruling class are acting only through ignorance. However, the trade unions, they are causing anarchy, telling the assembled leaders that to govern an empire like this, if it should be once thrown into confusion, is a task of which none among the working class, and few among any class, can form any adequate conception. And that those fighting for more political rights for the working class were too ignorant and inexperienced to find a remedy to the existing evils. Because remember, Robert Owen is fundamentally a philosopher of education, and he believes any political fight or political reforms which occur prior to his education reforms would at best be pointless and at worst be anarchic, divisive and destructive. This patronising attitude obviously did not go down well with the trade union leadership, who accused him of being in the pay of the British state. Robert Owen was not in the pay of the British state, but he may as well have been, for he used his position at the head of this important trade union organisation to dampen down the strikes and help the government. He successfully managed to dampen down the strikes, but in the process he destroyed his credibility with the working class movement and proved himself a little too radical for the ruling class. He would live until 1858, but this would be his last meaningful chance at any type of power.
Tan yn ein calon a than yn ein gwaith, tan yn ein crefydd a than dros ein hiaith.
It is often said that there is more of Methodism than Marxism about the British Labour Party. Equally, we could say there is more Robert Owen than Karl Marx. While very few people read the works of Robert Owen today, I would argue that the British left never quite escaped his politics. The left wing in Britain has always been accommodationist in nature, allergic to militant agitation or revolution. We could see this in the fact that by the 1920s, the Labour Party had become the only major socialist party in Europe to uphold a system of monarchy. Or in the current Labour leadership's refusal, much like Robert Owen, to support the striking workers. This is a politics in which the only thing worse than injustice is anarchy, and it is a belief that anarchy always comes from below. So what, in the end, can be said about the politics of Robert Owen? Well, he correctly saw the exploitation of the working class as an injustice, and he wanted to change that. But he saw no role for the oppressed in the fight for their own liberation. As we have seen in his initial education reform, or in his fight with the trade unions, he believed it must be the ruling class, and the ruling class alone, who end injustice. And at New Lanark and New Harmony, he had demonstrated that a rich man could use his resource to try and work toward a better world. And he believed that all other rich men could, should, and would follow his example. But Robert Owen was wrong. We do not have injustice because the ruling class is ignorant or because the system is broken. We have the system we have because it is not in the material interest of the ruling class to build a better one. The injustices that Robert Owen saw were not accidental, but a feature of the system of capitalism. And that's what the working class were trying to tell him. But Robert Owen would not listen, and his followers would not listen. But we should.
Hail the year so long expected, hail the day of full release. Zion's walls are now erected, and the watchmen publish peace. Throughout Shiloh's wide dominion, hear the trumpet loudly roar. Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more.